we come to this interesting question of the relationship between religious awareness and what Ibn Arabi has been called the imagination créatrice. You see, there is an elaboration at the level of belief which the people develop in order to stimulate their own religious awareness, to spiritualize their own religion. Because we have a habit of speaking of a religion that you accept a belief. And one does accept a belief. One is introduced to a belief, one grows into that. But a belief has to be personalized. And that means that on the basis of what you have accepted as a belief, in order to make that belief a personal possession, a possession which also allows oneself to, so to speak, progress from believing something to experiencing something. That's a different quality. That's the activity of the soul, which then totally absorbs what has been given to it and creates a kind of world in which that belief can ripen into experience. And in other words, it's not enough, it's all right for a religious person to believe and to hold fast to that belief, but a belief has to become living. Then it has to grow out into something. And that means that there, that element of human imagination has to expand from basic forms of which have been transmitted to it into something which is highly personal. And so there you get that interesting feature with so much of ancient religions between the historical groundwork and what out of that historical groundwork is elaborated in the religious awareness of individual adherents, individual believers, who create something out of it in order that it may create a kind of spiritual awareness in them. You find that already in the great scriptures of the world. You find it in the Vedantic tradition, in Hinduism. You find it in Islam. You find it in practically every religion. And so one has to take account of this, that not only believing something will turn a person into a very spiritual being, as Myht said, if, people who were very pious, very good believers, if that had been sufficed, that just you believe in something, that is it. You don't do anything with it, but just believe something. That for many people is simply not enough. It has to become something personal. In other words, you have a historical groundwork, which is a given, and then you get a religious awareness, which is imparted in a particular person, and then it becomes the responsibility of a particular person to elaborate something beyond a historical reality into, let us say, a mythological one. Now, a mythological one is nothing to be, if you're an historian, you might say, well, this is genuine history and the other thing is just mythology. But it's not just mythology. It's just how in the human spirit a belief operates in such a way that it becomes a belief that a person can handle on the way to his spirituality. That's that imagination créatrice. And that is precisely what we find, of course, in many different religious traditions in many different ways. And in this tradition of the Isra and the Miraj, you find it in a very particular way, because as you know, that has impressed the Islamic tradition so very much that idea, that picture, that imagery of the Prophet communicating with all the unseen realities beyond this life, that it has caused an enormous literature, which you find expanded everywhere. Now, from a strictly historical base, you might know that research on this point has been quoted by different scholars, and one of them has been a famous Professor Alfred Guillaume. and great English scholar and theologian, and he notes that the historical basis for this story was really the one expression in the Quran, which he gives as an example how out of a historical reality something would emerge which is a kind of mythological expansion which has its own validity. Well, just to give purely the research point of view, the scholarly point of view, the historical point of view, we have this tradition which says, the first one, Surah 17, the beginning of Surah 17. Glorious is he who made his servant go by night from the sacred mosque to the farther mosque, whose surroundings we have blessed, that we might show him some of our signs. And then the Guillaume goes to say, around this verse, a whole literature has gathered. It has given birth to two separate legends, and then he speaks about the Isra and the Mi'raj, of course, and the stories as just we have heard them, how the Prophet ascended the heavens. Of course, there are other traditions, as you say, that it was a visionary
recording in progress.
A visionary experience, which appeals very much, of course, to the Sufis and to the mystics in general, because it's precisely the visionary experience which has, for a mystic, a greater reality than any physical experience. It is something which is the reality of the spirit, and that's why a greater reality than anything which might happen in the finite circumstances of the world. So then that's now further it is said that precisely there are two early writers, Abu Ishaq is one of them, and who have recorded events which you do not find in most other. There is an enormous literature about the Mi'raj, of course, but two earlier writers who wrote about it have not been often included because their visions, their recordings were too early to be useful in the subsequent development of the different versions about this event. And then it is said that the farther mosque and the religion was, in fact, was that the Prophet went by night from the further mosque, in a place called Al-Ji'rana, which is about 15 kilometers from Mecca. And from there, he went to the sacred mosque in the 8th year of the Hajj. That is to say, the sacred mosque, of course, in Mecca. And so he went there by night. And why he went there by night? Because it was still a place which was, as they say in the tradition, which was used by idolaters. So the Prophet wouldn't have gone in daytime when the idolaters would have been there, and he, so to speak, by his presence would kind of legitimize or gain some recognition for the idolaters as well. He went by night. And so from Al-Ji'rana to Mecca, he went from one mosque to the mosque, to the sacred mosque in Mecca. And so that is said that was the pure historical outline of what happened. But as from that, of course, different versions of interpretation arose. And there you get a particular process. And I repeat again, there is one set of reality, which is the historical happenings. But in order for people to appropriate a mystical sense from their beliefs, from their whatever their concept of the divine, something has to be elaborated as from it in order to personalize it, in order to make a spiritual experience a live experience for them, not just a belief in something, what something happens to it, but to help themselves into that kind of awareness of a spiritual reality. That is what we see, and we see it in many of the traditions in Islam, in many of the hadiths, etc. We see the same thing, of course, in Hinduism and in practically every religion, how precisely that personalization of an historical event may ripen into a kind of mythology, which for people carries some kind of inspiration for their own spiritual awareness. So there are these different levels of approach. And of course, we have to remain aware of all of them and respect all of them in order to give them on their proper place. Because very often these things are not understood. And there you've got people who just dismiss all these kind of religious traditional stories as just people invented something and you know how wonderful it was. It meets a particular need in a particular condition of a particular person's spiritual awareness at a certain time. That is where the nourishment is. And as religion is nourishment to the spirit and nourishment to the soul, these are the further elements of nourishing the spirit and making the essence of religion functional for the person who adheres or who develops these kind of further perspectives. It's not something we have to dismiss, it's something we have to respect. Also, as I said, when the Quran refers to an historical event, the Prophet who went to Mecca in the night and returned after that, or if we want to say that it was a vision which the Prophet had in his meditations, in his sleep in the night, which is, you know, is a very firm tradition as well. In whatever way these traditions operate, they are for a particular group of people, or for a particular person, for a group of people, for a number of believers, it had a kind of spiritual nourishment, which enriched not only their religious beliefs, but their spiritual awareness.